This is a welcome on behalf of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia and the Wallace House Center for Journalists. I'm Douglas Northrop. I am the acting director this year of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and I'm also a professor of history and Middle East studies here at the university. And I'm here standing at the podium at the outset to highlight the partnership between the Weiser Center, WCEE, and the Wallace House Center for Journalists in bringing this program to campus. I'm happy to say that today marks the third collaboration between the Eisendrath Symposium and WCEE's panel series. Today we're discussing migration in Europe. First, just a word to note that the Eisendrath Symposium is held in honor of Charles Eisendrath, who is the former director of Wallace House, and I'm very glad to say he's with us today, sitting here in the front, and I wanted to recognize him. And publicly to thank him for his lifelong commitment to international journalism like this. After the panel discussion today, we'll have time for questions and answers with the audience. I'm hoping after that you'll join us as well for a reception across the hall. That'll be a chance to continue the conversation and to speak individually with the panelists. Now, just a word about the people who'll be with us today. Lynette Clemetson, seated to my right, here is the current director of the Wallace House for Journalists. She will be leading the discussion. Before coming to Michigan, Lynette was a correspondent for Newsweek, based variously in Washington and Hong Kong. She also worked for the New York Times and served as Senior Director of Strategy and Content Initiatives for NPR. The three journalists and current Wallace House Fellows, Knight-Wallace Fellows, who will be participating in the discussion today are seated to her right. Ismail Einashe is a London-based journalist who works on migration and refugee issues. He's published in Foreign Policy, The Guardian, BBC News, The Nation, The Sunday Times, among others. He's also the author of Strangers, which is a book that explores migration through the lens of art, and has co-edited Lost in Media, Migrant Perspectives in the Public Sphere, which is a collection of essays on how migrants are represented in European media. Einashe is also part of an international team that's working to investigate the disappearance of child migrants. Jedrzej Slodkowski is a reporter and currently deputy head of the culture section of Gazeta Wyborcza, which is Poland's largest newspaper. He's originally a music critic, but recently has come to focus on migration and refugee issues as well, including editing an annual special edition of the paper edited by migrants and refugees themselves. Sarah Souli has lived and reported across the Mediterranean with a focus on how large political structures intersect with the lived experiences of individuals, including those marginalized in a variety of ways. Her work has also appeared widely in The Atavist, The Economist, Politico, The Guardian, Vice magazine, Condé Nast Traveler, among others. And that's the people who'll be with us today. Please join me now in offering the panelists a warm welcome, and I'll pass it over to Lynette.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas. We appreciate the warm introduction and the partnership over several years. And I smiled while you were doing the introductions because Jedrzej may think that we have this partnership because it's the one partnership on campus where Jedrzej Slodkowski rolls off the tongue. We know that you will pronounce it well. And I want to thank Charles Eisendrath, who this symposium is created for. And you've heard me say this before if you've been to this event in previous years. Charles ran Wallace House, was my predecessor for 30 years, and I was a Knight-Wallace Fellow, and one of the reasons it was the only program I applied to of the fellowships in the United States for journalists was because this fellowship had a strong emphasis on international reporting. I had been an international reporter, and Charles built this program with the care of international journalists and a focus on international reporting into the structure of the fellowship in a way that's really admirable. So thank you always, Charles. And I'm really proud to carry on your legacy. Woo. So it's wonderful to see so many people here and actually to see students coming in today. It's always good when we see a lot of students in the audience. We're going to be covering a lot of information, and the benefit of having these three panelists here is because they have deep experience in covering migration in different parts of Europe. So we're going to be moving around a bit. And we're going to start by giving you some grounding in the time period we're talking about, the numbers we're talking about, so bear with us in the beginning while we're a little bit numbers heavy, and then we're going to move into making sure that this conversation is grounded in people and in stories of those people who are forced to move for safety and the politics surrounding their movement. So with that, we'll get started. I'm going to start with you, Ish, and we're going to start with a map. As I said, I think we need to give people some grounding. And first, we'll start with the grounding in the time period that we're talking about. Of course, when we talk about migration anywhere in the world, we're talking about centuries of the movement of people for various reasons. And we want to be reminding people that we have always moved as a people for our safety, for our families' lives, for our livelihood. And this period that we're going to be talking about in Europe is banded really from 2015 onward, and a change in the politics and language around migration. So Ish, can you start off with talking to people about this map and what we want people to know about around how this current period of migration is being characterized in Europe?
Yes, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and it's a pleasure to be doing this panel with my fellow fellows and in front of Charles. So I'm going to take you to the summer of 2015. In that summer, we saw the single largest movement of people into Europe seeking asylum since the Second World War. We saw 1.3 million people arrive, primarily through Turkey and the eastern route, through Greece, but also through the central route of the Mediterranean, through Italy, and even on the west from Morocco into Spain. These people were fleeing persecution, violence, and specifically in the context of the Syrian war, they were fleeing the brutality of that regime. But also they were coming from other countries, so situations where there was war in Afghanistan or in Iraq, but also from within the African continent. They were coming from Eritrea because they were fleeing situations of forced military conscription in that country, for example, or from Senegal. But that year, that summer, we saw the single largest movement since the Second World War. And the reaction was huge. And that moment in Europe became the most mediated moment of recent times. In fact, that movement of people across the Mediterranean, the boats, the barbed wire, all the images that we see of people moving into Europe became one of the most photographed moments in European history.
I'm going to move to a photograph
Yes,
now,
you
and
are.
that people may be familiar with.
So this image was taken by Kate Stanworth, who's a British photographer that I work with, and is taken on the southern part of Sicily. It's one of the many beaches that you find in that part of the island where there are abandoned ships like this, or their clothes, remnants of lives that almost certainly died in this situation, this boat. I know we'll talk more about that later on, but I want to go back to the point of the question of crisis, because often we talk about this moment of 2015-16 in which we're acknowledging the 10th anniversary this year as a crisis. But who was it a crisis for, you might ask yourself? It was certainly a crisis, perhaps most certainly, for the people coming from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, making dangerous, perilous journeys in search of hope and safety and protection. Perhaps it was a crisis for people in Lesbos or in Lampedusa, or where this boat is in the southern part of Sicily, where there were people literally landing. But was it a crisis for Europe collectively, a continent of 500 million people with a $20 trillion economy? I would argue not. And that moment in 2015, that summer, had a really powerful symbolic moment. I'll take you to the morning of the 2nd of September of that year, when the body, the lifeless body of a 3-year-old boy was found washed up on a holiday beach in Bodrum in Turkey. His name was Alan Kurdi. He was a Syrian boy of Kurdish background. And that moment was captured by a Turkish photographer. And that image went everywhere. It became a rallying call. And around that same time, the most powerful political figure in Europe, the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, did something, in that moment, at least extraordinary. Responding to this crisis, if it was a crisis, it was a humanitarian crisis at Europe's border, she said, we can do it. And she allowed almost 1 million Syrians and others to arrive in Germany. I think she was hoping for some of the people arriving, for some of them to be shared amongst the nation of families in Europe. That did not happen. So this went from a, quote, crisis of migration and borders to a crisis of European solidarity. It went into crisis of European empathy. And rather than respond to people moving and crossing into the borders of Europe, seeking safety and protection, we unfortunately saw the opposite, even in the case of Angela Merkel. Within a few months, by 2016, she had done the opposite. She started to pull up the drawbridge. And that happened across Europe. And another aspect of this moment, which is really important to remember, was that in Europe, we were dealing with a political situation that was particularly febrile and dangerous. We had the Euro crisis, most evident in Greece and Italy, the countries at the external border of Europe, receiving people arriving. But also in my country, in the United Kingdom, we had our own political moment. That year, 10th anniversary this year, in June, I was reporting on the border of Europe, meeting refugees that were arriving, and I'd already cast my vote by postal vote, but the Brexit referendum happened, and we voted to leave the European Union. So that was the context. We're talking about this movement of people, but we're talking about this political moment that was particularly febrile in Europe. And an aspect of that also was that the idea of migrant came to enter, I'll finish on this, came to enter our language. It became part of this, the cultural landscape. And I thought, where did I hear migrant before? I rarely heard that. I probably heard it before 2015 in one of Sir David Attenborough's documentaries for the BBC, the migrating wildebeest and so on, but you never heard it applied to people. So that moment was a humanitarian crisis, but it became a border crisis that became a crisis of European solidarity, and then in the end, it became framed as a migrant crisis. And that's the consequence of where we are now, that we're living with that. This framing, this lens of crisis has permanently been etched into the space in Europe.
And so what we're going to be talking about here today is framing and challenging us all to think about, when we think about migration, how we frame this issue, how we frame it as journalists, how we frame it as policy people, how we frame it as human beings in our mind. You characterized this crisis as a crisis of solidarity and of empathy. In the popular consciousness in Europe, it was starting to be framed as a crisis of people invading, migration as invasion. And that takes then the focus away from the danger to the people in movement. And Sarah, I want to turn to you now to talk about the danger involved in these crossings and what people were willing to go through in the pursuit of safety.
Thank you, Lynette. First, I'm going to ask the audience to close their eyes. And if you will, just think about the Mediterranean. Maybe there's warm wind, the smell of pine trees, how it mixes with the heat of the sun, this azure water lapping at your feet. Maybe someone's handing you a plate of fried calamari. Maybe you're on your honeymoon. I think for a lot of us, when we think about the Mediterranean, it is this place of beauty and holiday and relaxing, and that's part of it, for sure. It's also a place of immense contradiction. The Mediterranean migratory route is the most dangerous one in the world by far.
And if you haven't opened your eyes yet,
yes,
open
now's a
your
good
eyes.
time.
Yes.
We can do a guided meditation afterwards. But this is a map from the International Organization of Migration, which is responsible for collecting data on the number of people who die while trying to cross into safety. These numbers are vastly underreported. Every year there's hundreds, maybe thousands of people who die and essentially they just disappear. So the data that we do have shows that from 2015 to 2026, nearly 35,000 people died trying to cross the Mediterranean. That's 3 or 4 times as many as the people who died trying to cross into the United States. There are 3 main routes that Ish alluded to across the Mediterranean. The first is the Eastern Mediterranean route, which is from Egypt, but mostly Turkey, coming into Greece. That was very popular in 2015. And essentially, there's kind of this game of whack-a-mole that happens where every time there's a route that becomes sort of shut down or very heavily policed by the European Union and by Border Patrol, you have other routes that pop up. So the Central Mediterranean route, which is from Libya and increasingly Tunisia into Italy, has now become the single most dangerous one in the world. Then you have the Western Mediterranean route, which is from Morocco towards the Canary Islands or mainland Spain. These numbers are very shocking, and I think they're numbers that really evoke a sense of grief, as they should, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact within our grief that this is a crime. It's a crime against humanity, the number of people who die. It's a crime the way that Europe has responded to a humanitarian crisis, but it doesn't have to be that way. Things can change, and hopefully, as we'll explore in this talk, there are different possibilities. But I also want to say, in terms of borders, people are always going to move, and people are always going to find a way to search for their freedom, to search for their safety in particular, to search for their dignity. That happens on the external borders of Europe. That also happens internally in Europe as you have different borders that become increasingly dangerous, militarized, policed. You have new borders and new ways of people crossing emerging.
Yeah, hello everyone. It's so nice to see so many friends and strangers, but maybe future friends. And so Sarah took us to Mediterranean, and I would like to also to invite you to some imagination exercise.
And I'm going to go to a beautiful image that you shared with us to get people in this framework.
But you can also close your eyes. So imagine your name is Avin. You're 38. In search of a decent life, you leave Iraqi Kurdistan for Belarus with your husband. 5 children and the 6th children in your womb. From Minsk, the capital of Belarus, you're taken to Europe's last true ancient forest on the border with Poland, a land of swamps, bisons, wolves, bobcats. With a larger group of Kurds, you cross the green border into Poland, into the European Union. You apply for asylum, but Polish guards brutally push you back to Belarus. Your group wanders, hiding from Belarusian guardians. Maybe you saw the guardians beating other people just for fun, stealing their money, phones. But you manage to cross the border again. Then you try to avoid Polish patrols, which sometimes were brutally, like equally brutal, and to avoid another pushback. So after 5 days in this forest, you have no food left. You drink the paddle from the paddles, and it's so cold. It's November. You're in your 24th week of pregnancy. You collapse. You lie for two days, and then Polish activists find your group in the forest. So, but that time your body temperature is 82 Fahrenheit, which is, I think, 28 degrees in Celsius. So you have hypothermia, but also you have acidosis. And 2 years later, in the hospital, you miscarry. Your husband names your son Halikari and buries him in a nearby village. Your husband and kids are sent to the refugee center, one of very few refugee centers in Poland. But this center feels and works rather like a prison. But you don't really know that. Despite 3 weeks of doctors' efforts, you die. And your body is sent back to Iraq. So this is one of the many tragedies that have unfolded since 2021 on the border between Poland and Belarus.
Jedrzej, I want you to explain, because you explained to us exactly
Yeah.
what is being shown here in this image.
So this is the one of the greatest photos of my fellow photojournalist Agnieszka Sadowska from Gazeta Wyborcza, who spent months in the forest, photographing migrants, photographing border guards' brutality, and you know, this is feat of someone who spent many days in the forest. And you know, imagine going to the jungle with a suitcase on the wheel, with the wheel. You know, this is crazy. So yeah, so I've chosen it because I think it's very symbolic. And you know, I want to say something else, but when I was walking here today, it reminded me my family story, that my great-grandfather just exactly 100 years before that story was fleeing from, after Polish-Soviet Union war, from Soviet Union with my 3 months old granddad to Poland. And there were just the new borders. But the border was closed at the time. Paul said, no, like the window is closed. We are not taking another people, even though they are Polish. But some amazing miracle happened. When they got to the border, it turned out that their cousin, my great-granddad cousin, is the one of the guardians, and they let them in illegally. So, but many people now, 100 years after that, they don't have
have someone looking out for them.
Yeah. So this is like Belarus route. We can maybe change the slide if you're not familiar with the geography of Europe. And in the recent great story in the New Yorker, by the way, with the photos of my longtime friend Jedrzej Slodkowski, the New Yorker journalist called this Belarus route the world's most politically engineered migration route. And I will tell you very quickly why. Because it was designed in Minsk and Moscow as a tool to destabilize Europe, especially European Union. So this is how it works. I will tell you in 7 steps. So in first step, in summer 2021, Belarus encourages via TikTok, via WhatsApp, in other like Facebook, like people from very poor countries in Africa and Asia to fly in. They promise them a wonderful life in Germany and things like that. Then Belarusian takes thousands of the people, push them to the border with Poland, to this forest. The Poland is at that time completely unprepared for this situation. So border crossings are sealed on both sides, and also at that time Poland is not very welcoming because, like generally, I would say that Poland is very not welcoming to people of the different color, skin color. But that time especially because it is ruled by far right-wing authoritarian party Law and Justice, which just stirring up a smear campaign against people from Africa and Middle East and Afghanistan. So that time the Polish border guards just stopped denying asylum's application, and they are pushing back people to Belarus. And I told you the story of Evin. Their family only was pushed back 2 times, but there's stories about families like this who were pushed back 25 times, about women who were just thrown through the fence, like 5-meter fence. Imagine that, things like that. like the pregnant women, like the, yeah. So then, but then you see, then you can see in TV, you know, like border and, you know, thousands of angry Kurds, Arabs, and Africans invading Poland. So it was it was a
And
huge
a choice
yeah.
about positioning.
Yeah.
A choice to position as an invasion.
Yeah, so it was invasion, and you know, it was like Belarus, and you know, Belarus is not an independent country. It's like, it's a really, it's a, even like the one country with Russia, like they have union state. So it was just designed by them, like this. They knew that, like when they, you know, like push so many angry young men, not female, on the border, you know, the Polish right-wing supporters will go crazy, and they will talk about invasion. So the Polish authorities, like, they closed the border zone for journalists, also for these activists saving people's life. But in the same time, like, many people just make it through, and also the whole, like, smuggling business started, and the people were succeeded in coming to Germany, because everyone wants to go to Germany, some to Sweden, and Germany at some point gets very fed up, because they have their own problem. In the Eastern Germany, the far right wing Alternative for Deutschland party is you know, is the biggest party, and now it's also I think the biggest party also in like the most popular party in whole Germany. So the time the Prime Minister of Germany just decided to reinstate border controls with Poland. And you know, like, the free open borders is one of the most important, like, the European values we have in European Union. So we had tension in Poland, huge social division, and the same in Germany at the time. And then we could see, like, tensions between Poland and Germany, because Germans start to push migrants back to Poland, because they should apply for asylum in Poland, not in Germany. And of course, Germany has amazing amount of migrants now. So so when Polish nationalists saw that, they, like, hundreds of them, went to the border to form patrols. They were hunting for migrants, and many of them, they were soccer hooligans. And the time we were in the middle of election campaign, and far right wing candidate was also the ex soccer hooligan, and guess what? He won the election.
So with this, you've been moving us into, we've given some background on the routes people have moved through and the reasons that caused the move. I want to pull back a bit and talk about the politics of all of this. And I'm going to ask each of you to speak about it a bit. But let's talk about how countries started responding to this movement and the pushback across borders. And Ish, I'm going to come back to this picture of Merkel and Erdogan and just give people a sense of what this is, because Jedrzej was talking about the push and pull across borders.
Yes, a response to the so-called migrant crisis of 2015 was to militarize the border of Europe, the external border. So the European Union essentially engaged in a policy where they were saying that they were deterring migrants from making the journey, and therefore they'd make the border very dangerous. So that involved things like packs, now at the moment return hubs, and situations like this. This is a photograph from Albania from a site. It's got containers, and these containers are places where people are held. I will take you to 2024 when the EU Asylum Pact passed. That pact allows for the detention of children now in similar situations. So the response was to, we had that brief moment of empathy after the death of Alan Kurdi, and Angela Merkel announced that policy. And then the response after that was complete opposite. It became about this harsh border policy designed to keep people out and let people die as a way to deter others from coming. That policy miserably failed because, as Sarah said before, people will find a way to move if they have to. If they have to flee violence, if they have to flee situations of instability, people will find a way to move. But that policy from 2016 and 15 is now just everywhere, even though it's important to make the point that migration, broadly speaking, in Europe is a historic low. We're not talking about the numbers from 2015-16. And there's one thing I didn't add, Lynette, which is really important also for the audience to remember, is that in 2015 and 16, when the crisis, it was a crisis in Syria was happening, say, the majority of Syrian refugees stayed in that region. They stayed in Lebanon. They did not come to Europe. They were in Turkey. So we always have to bring that frame into this discussion. Who's at crisis for? Who does crisis serve? Who does the border infrastructure serve? We always have to bring it to that question. And I will make this point. In the last few years, what we've seen is a rapid growth in the whole infrastructure of the border violence, I would call it. At the moment, in the European Parliament, there is the Returns Pact, which is passing through the Parliament at the moment. And that effectively is going to allow European countries to take people to third countries. So that photograph is from Albania, but there are similar situations in famously Rwanda, I'll come to in a minute, but other countries as well. Tunisia, I know Sarah will talk about North Africa and Turkey after me, but that has become the way to deal with it. And this policy that's going through the European Parliament at the moment is fundamental erosion of the right to asylum, because if someone says comes from Bangladesh, now you might be surprised to know, but Bangladesh has always been one of the top 5 countries where people are coming from through the central Mediterranean route. So I spent a lot of my journalism career reporting from Italy, and I've reported a lot with Bangladeshis, and these are children who've gone through the most horrific violence and the most horrific smuggling and trafficking, which goes from Bangladesh via the Middle East, Libya, into Italy. Now, under this new proposal, Bangladesh is considered a safe country, even though the European Union itself acknowledges the human rights situation in that country with all the things that have happened to it since Sheikh Hasina was deposed. So you're telling me now you can have this return policy where anybody who comes from Bangladesh in Europe is not going to have the right to asylum, or Colombia and so on. So again, what we're doing is we are reducing the worth of somebody to their country of origin, and these policies are a manifestation of that. And I'll end on the UK, a shameful policy in the UK, which resulted in the spending of £700 million, which is, I think, close to $1 billion that the British government spent under Boris Johnson. And then this current government, the Labour government, got rid of the policy. And actually, when Labour came in, I got a commission from my editor of foreign policy to think, basically, if I had Keir Starmer in front of me, what advice would I give him about changing Britain's toxic immigration policy? And one of the first things was to get rid of the Rwanda policy. He did, but then he's now just gone on and done the same things. And now the UK government is even talking about bringing back a similar scheme. The reason why Rwanda was important was, yes, the money was spent, it was horrendous, no refugee ever ended up in Rwanda. Rwanda is a country which has terrible human rights record. We know that. We know the Kagame regime, what it does to its opponents. Yet the British government wanted to send people there, not give them a fair hearing. And the second thing is that this policy, despite the fact that it's like flogging a dead horse, or what do you say in America, beating, you guys don't say flogging a dead horse, right? Yes, this policy is like, flogging a dead horse, but it's inspired other countries, even in this country, in the United States. All the deals that this country has done last year to take people to Eswatini, to Rwanda. So the big picture is that even though Europe is experiencing less migration today. The border infrastructure has become much more sophisticated, much more militarized, and much more violent. And at the same time, what we're seeing is a fundamental erosion and protections for people who are literally fleeing for their lives, who, by the way, we haven't mentioned this, there are legal protections for people moving. You know, we talk about migrants so loosely and so freely, but migrant, refugee, asylum seekers, these things mean something. They mean specific things. They have legal definitions. And what's happening is that there's a fundamental erosion of that happening across Europe. During the pandemic, for example, in Austria, they suspended the right to asylum because of the border situation. And what you have is a continent which I began by talking about the 1.3 million people being a historic number since the Second World War. Well, you know, the infrastructure around the rights of refugees, for example, the Geneva Convention, all of that comes out of the conflict in Europe in the Second World War. But now we're going to a place where we are eroding those rights from a continent that helped create that and draft that, and denying people who are moving just for their lives the right to claim asylum and the right to be protected.
I want to move to Sarah. You mentioned these pacts. Sarah, can you talk to us a little bit about Northern Africa and how these pacts are shaped there?
Yeah, well, when you have a problem, the easiest way to solve it is to give it to someone else to deal with, right? That's a way to just wash your hands of whatever it is that you might be going through. And the EU has done a pretty good job of doing that these last 10 years. So back in 2016, Brussels brokered a deal with Ankara that then became sort of known as the model deal for these return hubs that Ish is talking about. I think we'll just go back a few photos. Yeah. Sorry to put this such pomp and circumstance in front of you.
It's so cool.
But so basically Ankara and Brussels brokered a deal that Turkey got $6 billion for every refugee that they took, every Syrian refugee that they took. One would be resettled in the European Union. At the time, Turkey was already host to the world's largest refugee population. This influx of money, obviously, was one of the main reasons why Turkey was able to take this on. I think I've spoken to a lot of people who were stuck in Turkey for a very long time and tried to cross into Greece. And the thing that keeps coming up again and again in these conversations of these return hubs or these EU pacts is we're talking about people who are being used as pawns on this geopolitical chessboard where you have these state actors who are so far emotionally and spiritually removed and materially removed from what it actually means to cross a border. So this 2016 pact was pretty monumental, and it became the model for other countries to follow. And basically the EU was looking at where are the places where people are leaving and how can we stop them. And as Ish mentioned, it is our human right, it is a human right guaranteed by the Geneva Convention that you are able to cross a border and ask for asylum. Whether you get asylum or not, of course, is a whole other process, but you have that right. And so what happens when you stop someone from even coming to ask for their human right? So the second country that had a pact with the EU was Libya, which I think most of us, I think we've read a lot about the way that refugees and asylum seekers have been treated in Libya. It's one of the most atrocious human rights violations on the bodies of individual people. So with Libya, it was a lot about training the Coast Guard, beefing up border patrol across the Mediterranean and stopping people from coming into Europe. From the back of the Libya deal, we then had a deal in 2023 with Tunisia. This one was interesting because it also included some small rights for some Tunisians to migrate as well. So there's always sort of this like push and pull of what can I offer you to help take a problem off of my back. And more deals have followed with Egypt, with Lebanon, with Mauritania, and with Jordan. So again, these are really people that we're talking about who are being used as pawns. And I'll also just give one very small example because on the surface it can seem like, oh yeah, this is a convenient idea for, you know, a solution to this problem that we have. But all these state actors are also going to act within their own interests. So in February 2020, right before COVID, Turkey actually was getting quite annoyed with this deal and with the amount of people that they were hosting. And so they quite literally opened the borders in sort of this like, we call it like a border spectacle, because suddenly you had 25,000 refugees and asylum seekers who were literally being bussed from major cities in across across Turkey, and they were being taken to the Greek-Turkish land border. Greece responded with sort of unbelievable military force. They used live bullets on people who were trying to cross, families, children, old people. Multiple people were killed, and at the time, the EU president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said she thanked Greece for being Europe's shield. So we really also have kind of this language and this rhetoric of Europe as a fortress. And I'm sure, have you guys all heard the term Fortress Europe? Does this ring a bell? Yes. So Fortress Europe is actually a Nazi propaganda term that Heinrich Himmler liked to use in a lot of his speeches. And over the last 10 years, it started to be used by mostly left-wing activists to describe the policies that Europe was enacting. And now it's a pretty common phrase that you hear. And I think, you know, we're talking a lot about sort of these right-wing populist reactions to migration, and those go very, very far back.
And that brings us to images like this, Sarah, that that's sort of a part and parcel of this reaction of violence, of othering, of fortress, of, can you talk to us about this picture?
Yeah, I'm curious how many people have seen this photo before? Really? One? I know my dad has seen this photo before. So I think also when we talk about Europe, I just want us to remember that Europe is a colonizing power that for much of its history has been violently extracting labor, wealth, and resources from across the African and Asian continents. And there's a thread to why we have such issues today. These aren't, you know, policy, or these aren't wars and acts of violence that happen in a vacuum. They have historical traces back. And I think colonialism and racism are not the only lenses through which to look at migration, but they certainly are useful ones. This is a photo from 1961, which was 1 year before Algeria gained its independence from the French, one of the most violent and bloody wars of independence. And this is in Paris. Some of you might recognize the Seine from behind, and it says, "Ici on noie les Algériens," here we drown Algerians. So this was sort of an orgy of violence against Algerian activists who were basically organizing for their rights in France and organizing for independence of Algeria. At least 200 people were killed, likely much more, as we see these numbers are often underreported, and several of them were drowned in the Seine. And I bring up this image and I bring up these roots because Europe is often talked about, especially in the US, as sort of this beacon of fraternité, human rights, equality, liberty. And there's truth to that, but it's also true that those are values that have only been allowed for certain people historically, and that continues to this day.
So you mentioned, I think all three of you have alluded to the fact that even though this period that we're talking about started with this documented massive movement of people in 2015, that the numbers have actually been going down. But the politics and the military border infrastructure has actually been increasing as the numbers have gone down. And so, Sarah, I know that I promise you that we're not going to do too many charts, but this one actually, I think, is illustrative.
I'm so not a graph guy, so I'm going to do my best to explain this graph to you.
You did make it.
And
you did make this.
Hopefully
Yes.
it's gonna make sense to you. I just want to say one last thing about contemporary migration and policing is that this is very new. So actually for most of the 20th century, you didn't need, 75% of the world's population did not need a visa to get into Europe. It was very easy for people to move. And after 85 and after the institution of the Schengen zone, that number dropped to 20%. This graph that I'm sorry to have you all looking at. So you guys are all familiar with the term military-industrial complex. I think There's a similar term that we use to describe the border around Europe, which is the border industrial complex. So I'm just going to give a very quick and dirty overview of migration policing in the last 10 years, which is, as Ish alluded to, kind of, you had first this expression of empathy that was translated into what we call SAR, which are search and rescue operations. So a lot of EU money was going into actually actively answering distress signals, answering distress signals and picking people up from the sea. And over these last 10 years, what we've seen is an increase in budgetary spending going towards military and defense contractors.
So I want to just link this to what Ish said in the beginning, that this initial response was one of, at least in some way, charity, right? And the initial response was search and rescue.
Well, I wouldn't say it was charity. I would say that is the responsibility of the Coast Guard. That is literally what they're supposed to do, save lives at sea. That is like the first thing you learn in any sort of like maritime law class, or whenever you even go to like learn how to sail. That's the ethos of it.
Yeah.
So they were just doing their job. I don't want to overly give credit to the Coast Guard, because at the same time they were also engaging in a lot of pushbacks. A pushback, by the way, for those who don't know, is when you literally move people back to the place that they came from, as opposed to allowing them to cross the border to apply for asylum. So what this graph hopefully shows you, and I'm sorry, I'm going to watch your eyes glaze over while I shout out some numbers at you, but the EU budget spending from 2021 to 2027, so the cycle we're currently in, is 43.9, almost $44 billion that's being spent on border control. That's surveillance technology, that's drones, that's Frontex, that's weapons, tear gas, bullets, rubber bullets. The budget for this cycle, this 2021 to 2027, that's a 123% increase from the previous cycle. The next budget that's coming up is 2028 to 2034, $81 billion. That's a 250% increase. What this graph shows is that as the spending is going up, number of arrivals are declining, but the number of people who are dying is actually increasing. So just a quick example, in 2015, as you were saying, it was, I think, 1.3 million people who arrived. About 3,500 people died. It's a lot of people. In 2025, we had 155,000 people who arrived, and we had 2,000 people who died. So the percentage is just increasing exponentially. Who's profiting? This is always, I mean, it's always so boring to say it's like, it's money, but it's always kind of money, is what I've learned as a journalist. So more spending equals more death, but it also is a boon for these military companies that are profiting off of people moving.
And I want to show this image that's a different way to sort of illustrate what we're talking about, that the border fences sort of illustrate this growth in border policing.
Yeah, so fencing is part of it as well. There are a couple of companies that profit heavily. There are Thales, Airbus, BAE Systems, Leonardo, which is Italian. You have Elbit Systems and Israel Aerospace, which are particularly used by European companies or European countries for their Heron drone. I would also like to point out that Israel is being taken to the ICJ for the genocide they're committing against Palestinians. So we have countries and companies that are actively involved in gross human rights violations. Their weapons are being bought at a profit by European countries and then are then being used on migrants. And I think the other thing when we talk about surveillance and weapon technology, because it can seem quite abstract and we're sitting here in this, room far away in Michigan, but that same surveillance technology is increasingly being used in the US. It's being used on journalists. It's being used on protesters, as we've seen in anti-ICE demonstrations.
So we've given everybody a lot of grounding. We're here to talk about covering migration as journalists. And you each have done it's such a big and complex story, and you each have approached it from your regions and covered different slices of this. Jedrzej, I want to come in to your work, because when you came to the fellowship, you had come from doing a lot of deep reporting on Russia's successful attempts to move around the world and recruit mercenaries to engage in the ongoing war with Ukraine. And can you talk a little bit about that view into migration?
Yeah, thank you. So no numbers, don't worry. You can scale, yeah. So here you can see the map that shows the countries Russia from which Russia recruits mercenaries to send them after that to Ukraine, and a vast majority of these countries, account only for a handful of individuals, like the U.S., like European countries, except for Serbia and Belarus. So there's just a few people from these places, but I would like to focus on African countries, which is a huge reservoir of mercenaries, and Russia is very present there. The Russia is co-governing Mali, Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, one of Libya governments, and some other countries, and they are there with their military. Like once it was called Wagner Group, and now it's Afrikański Korpus, which has a beautiful English translation, Afrika Korps, just exactly like Hitler. German Hitler forces in Africa, and I think it's not an accident. And so you have many countries like Kenya and Ghana, where they're recruiting thousands of people, hundreds and thousands of people, and then you have one more thing. So Russia is so powerful in Africa, also because there was a vacuum after France and Great Britain just came to home, came back, leave these countries. So then Russia just came
And I feel
as a colonial power, as a new colonial power there.
And so now we are talking about Russia as a sort of colonizing force.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm reading more about this issue of mercenaries now. I just want to see in the room how many people have consumed stories recently about the recruitment of people to send to Ukraine to fight on Russia's side. So this
Wow.
is, yeah.
It's amazing.
So this is, I think just in the past couple of months, this story is breaking through.
Yeah.
And
So but when I more than 1 year ago went to Nepal, which was then I think the biggest reservoir of mercenaries, it wasn't so popular. It wasn't so this story wasn't so big. And I've spent there like more than 2 weeks to talking with families of people who died or disappeared, with mercenaries who by miracle survive and were able to come back, and this guys. So maybe I would just put just a quick framework. Because when you think about mercenaries, I think there's like imagination told you is telling you that there are some aggressive guys who just want to to shoot to other people. But in this case, it's more like extreme labor migration, and also like the really perverted scam. And the scam works like that Russia, by also outsourcing this to local work agencies and politicians, is encourage people to come to Russia very often just to work. Because from the U.S. perspective, Russia is not a wealthy country, but from the perspective of majority of the world, it's a paradise. So, and then when they go there, they are sent as cannon fodder to the front line, and
with their passports confiscated.
Yeah. So something like this happened to these guys. This is on the left. You can see Dinesh, and on the right, my right. So yeah, you're also Dawa. There are guys from were guys from the central Nepal, from the quite poor village, and so what happened to them? They wanted to be Gurkhas, the famous Nepali mercenaries who had been fighting for or serving in the British Army for 200 years, and they failed the exam on the last stage. They dedicated their whole teenager years to prepare for that. They were trained, and they need money because Nepal is the second poorest country in Asia after Afghanistan, and the unemployment rate among youth is crazy, really, and they are not producing anything. There's just tourism, and they are reselling goods from imported from India and Russia. So they found the ad of French Foreign Legion, and they thought, okay, let's go there. But they have to collect $10,000 each, which is also like crazy money. So they sold everything they could. They borrowed money from the families, borrowed money from some loan sharks, and they went to the airport with some broker. But surprisingly, they landed in Moscow, not in Paris. And then in Moscow, they were abandoned without money and any support. So in despair, they found another ad about work in army as cooks, as like bodyguards or something like this. So they went there, and after very short training, they were sent as cannon fodder to Bakhmut region, And that time, and still there are so heavy fights there. And what Russians are doing, if you're not familiar with that, they are just sending waves of soldiers, like the rows, like the assaults. So Dawa told me that once he remembered that Russians sent like 20 assaults, like rows of soldiers who are just running, to the fire of snipers. And, after maybe killing, after some weeks and months, maybe they will, push the front line maybe of 5 inches and something like this. So this is their strategy. That's why Russia needs people, like yesterday, I've checked, Russia lost 1,710 people. It means like they killed and wounded people. And it's going worse and worse because Ukrainians are also more and more effective now. So Dinesh was killed, like blown away just in front of his best buddy after a couple of weeks. And once Dawa realized that he's the only one who left alive, there's no one there, he's trapped between Russian and Ukrainian front lines. And he spends there in some trench with the sleeping with bodies of his colleagues 4 days. Then he was wounded and found, fortunately for him, by Russian soldiers and sent to hospital. But he was really heavily wounded, and but Russians need people, so they sent him back. And when he realized they really want to send him, even he was on crutches still, to the front line.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
move us forward.
Yeah, the
because I
last,
want to
last
make
sentence.
sure we have
The
time.
last sentence. He just managed to escape. He found someone who sent him a pin, and he, on the crutches, he ran 25 kilometers to another broken who took him to Nepal.
So I want to move us to another approach to this kind of reporting, because Ismail, you came here having done really exceptional reporting for a project called Lost in Europe. Can you tell us the purpose of Lost in Europe and the frame through which you approached your reporting?
Yes, so Lost in Europe was founded in 2018 because children are often forgotten in the stories around migration. In fact, in almost every story around migration, but obviously children are the most impacted, the most numbers, the most dead. And in 2016, we had a statement from the then head of Europol, who said that year that 10,000 children had disappeared in Europe in 2016. And I started to look into these numbers, but so did other journalists in Europe that are covering migration. And I ended up meeting journalists from the Netherlands and from Italy, and then we founded Lost in Europe, which is a cross-border investigative journalism outfit. We investigate the disappearance of child migrants in Europe. Now we are a team of over 20 journalists. We're in 14 countries. We're working for media like the Dutch broadcaster VPRO, NRC in the Netherlands, De Standard, NAC in Belgium, BBC and Guardian that I work for in London, Domani in Italy, and many other publications. And what we do is we both tell the stories of children that have disappeared, and specifically unaccompanied minors. That's our focus, specifically. We cover other aspects of migration, but that's a real issue that we saw in 2015-16, was that nobody was really covering the story of what happened to the thousands of unaccompanied minors that had gone missing. This, if you could just go back, sorry, Lynette. This graph is from an investigation that we did a couple of years ago now, and it's on CNN. You can read the story. Every 3 years, we do a data investigation. So we ask every country in Europe, not just the European Union, but the UK, Moldova, others, how many children, unaccompanied minors, have disappeared after registration. So these are children that have arrived in a country, they've arrived in Greece, in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, and they've been in the system, but then they've disappeared. Now, the map shows, just the highlighted sections, the darker blue shows countries which have the highest number of disappeared children. So in that investigation from 2021 to 2023, we uncovered that 50,000 unaccompanied migrant children had disappeared. This data is inconsistent, incomplete, and it's only based on data from 13 countries, 12 of which provided data. The UK, my country, did not. I made a freedom of information request to the Home Office, and they did not come back to me. And in the middle of it, an election was called. So now I'm in a long-standing dispute with them. But anyway, what this shows is the fact that children, unaccompanied minors, are at the most risk. If you go to the next slide, Lynette, thank you. Children like Taka, who came from Gambia, I met in 2016 in Sicily, photographed by Kate Stanworth. He's just one of many children like this, who arrive. In his case, he came from Gambia because he was searching for hope and out of economic poverty. But he went through the journey or the back way in Niger into Libya. He went into a slave camp essentially. He was tortured, he was imprisoned. And when he arrived in Europe, he was treated as a migrant. Let's go back to the terminology. Because he was a migrant, he was not deserving of the same rights and protections at that moment, say, as a Syrian might have been, because they were deemed to be refugees. So this is why I'm always skeptical about the terminology, and for us to constantly think about it more critically, because Taka might have not necessarily began his journey because of violence, but he endured violence. Yet he got into Europe, yet he survived the hardships, and he's not deserving of the same protections and rights of other people. It seems to me a cruel way to reduce the experiences of people on the move to their countries of origin. If you go to the next slide, Lynette, thank you. You will see that this is a photograph of a Nigerian woman and her child. So we both do stories and investigations about children missing, but also about very young children. In this story, briefly I'll share, this woman was one of 11,000 Nigerian women and girls were trafficked to Italy primarily in 2016 alone, in that year, 11,000. And these girls and women come from Edo State in this part of Benin City in Nigeria. Often, most of these girls and women are unfortunately caught up in traditional kind of witchcraft, if you like. There are these juju ceremonies which do take place. There's often a lot of kind of cliche about this in the media coverage, but these things do happen. And then these women arrive, and this woman here in the photograph, obviously anonymous, we have to protect people who are going through vulnerable situations, and that's what Kate took this image, had her child almost taken away from her because she ended up being forced to work as a forced sex worker. She was forced to live in a home in Palermo in Sicily, where she was held against her wishes by a trafficker. And then she managed to escape, and she found love. It was a beautiful story in the end. And she had a baby. And in this shelter she ended up in, she had a lot of problems, and she almost had her child taken away from her. And then this is an isolated case. Actually, it went to the European court. Not this case, another case in Italy, where Italy was chastised by the European courts for not taking into account a woman's experience of trafficking. Because what happens is that in many situations in Italy and other places in Europe, these very vulnerable women, some who have children because they've been raped. There was another horrific story that I worked on where a girl arrived at the age of 14 to Italy, and she had been raped by her captors in Libya, and she gave birth to a child, and then she subsequently went on to give another birth to another child, had both children taken away from her. So this is the kind of travesty that's happening around this vulnerable group of children, whether they're very young children or unaccompanied minors. And just a final slide before we move on.
And I do want to note that the work Lost in Europe, which, you know, there's some work that you do by assignment. What stands out about Lost in Europe is that this was the response of a group of reporters who had been doing this work and saw that this was an area that was not getting concentrated focus, and that you came together across borders to make a concerted effort to draw attention to this issue of children. And you were recognized in Europe with the Daphne Galizia Prize.
Yes, we did. We were very lucky to win the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize in 2024, handed by the European Parliament, and obviously named in honor of the great Daphne Caruana Galizia, who lost her life in Malta due to her work. Thank you, Lynette, for reminding me that we are a cross-border outfit, and what we do is we also work in a way where we pick up one bit of the picture in Greece. We have our colleague Ellie in Greece, we have our colleagues in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the UK, and then we're able to build up a picture. So the reason why I share this image was not just to share the prize that we won, which is great, but because we were able to give a speech, and we wrote a speech, my colleague Einashe, and she delivered the speech in the European Parliament, and it was a speech that, you know, we were very clear about the failure of the European Union and the European Parliament and European infrastructure as an entity to protect the rights of vulnerable unaccompanied minors. And we basically said in the speech to the President and afterwards to Roberta Metsola, the President of the European Parliament, that countries were not being cooperative. When we as journalists ask for information, which these countries have to hold, by the way, you know, the countries have to know, actually by EU law, like who's in their border, especially children. It's their responsibility. But when we make a freedom of information request to France, to other countries, they say, we don't have that data, they ignore us. And we got a firm commitment from the President of the European Parliament that this upcoming investigation we're going to do, again, following the data trail, that she will personally look into this. So again, it shows the impact of investigative journalism, and winning these awards is important, but it was an opportunity that we would never get normally, which was to be in the room with all the senior leaders of the European Parliament and say to them, we as journalists are working on this story in Europe, and what you're doing is not only failing these children, but as journalists working in this continent, you're denying us the right that we have to be able to investigate information. And it shouldn't be left to journalists, Lynette, to uncover this story of missing unaccompanied minors. This should be the responsibility of member states. This should be the responsibility of the European Union, and they're failing.
Sarah, I want to just lastly go to your experience in the region of Evros.
Yeah, thank you, Lynette. So I work a lot in Greece, and more specifically, I work a lot in Evros, which is the land border between Greece and Turkey. I think it's an interesting microcosm through which to look at EU policy in general. But I work a lot with the dead, actually. And Lynette, if you can go to the next slide. So in Evros, you have thousands of people who cross every year. And you have quite a few people who die. There's one person in the whole region who's responsible for identifying and collecting information on the people who die crossing the Evros River. His name is Pavlos Pavlidis. He's a Greek forensic scientist. And for every body that arrives, and I say body specifically because Evros is a freshwater river that separates Greece and Turkey, and fresh water, unlike the sea, doesn't preserve bodies. So the vast majority of bodies that end up in his morgue are completely disintegrated beyond recognition. It's really horrific to look at these photos and to have experience with these bodies. And what Pavlidis does is he takes these belongings and he puts them in plastic bags to wait to see if there's maybe someone who, a family member who might come and who might recognize something, who might recognize a plastic bracelet that says, I believe, who might recognize a cell phone, who might recognize a type of medication. I don't have a good answer for how we're supposed to talk about this or what we're supposed to do with this sort of information. It kind of just relentlessly brings me to my knees to know that you can live a whole life, a whole textured experience, and you die on Europe's doorstep, and all that's left of you is just this tiny plastic bag.
Yeah. And Ish talked about the children who are involved in this. A lot of the harm and the danger is also felt along lines of gender when we talk about these crossings. And I would love for you, before we turn to the audience, to talk a bit about how gender maps onto all of this movement.
Yeah, so I work also a lot with women, and I've done a lot of work on femicides, which are gender-specific violence. I would just like to say that women everywhere in the world and marginalized populations everywhere in the world face gender-based violence. I think it can often get pathologized when we talk about certain groups of people as having a more sort of violent nature towards women, but in my own personal experience as a woman navigating the world, I've had negative experiences just about everywhere. So it's true that you have many more men who cross compared to women. Usually what happens is you have family reunification, so women who come through other ways. But I will say that that border regimes exacerbate this existing gender-based violence, and that can come in the form of an overcrowded camp where you don't have access to something as simple as a tampon or a menstrual pad, where you might be too scared to go to the bathroom, where there aren't sanitary conditions to be able to wash yourself. Over 70% of women have reported sexual assault, either in their countries of transit or upon arrival in Europe. There's often a lot of fear with police, and we know that as well, even in the US, of just there's such a disparity between the amount of sexual assault that happens and then how comfortable people feel to report it, as well as mental health issues that are, depression, anxiety, over 95%. This is a photo from 2016 on the Greek North Macedonia border. it's horrific for anyone to cross a border under this level of violence, but just imagining being a mother holding on to her children, or being that older woman in the back on a cane trying to cross this forest, it sort of boggles the
There's
mind.
so much in this one image. So we're going to end on an up note, but I think that it's really incumbent upon us, and when we were talking about how we wanted to structure this conversation, a lot of what we do at Wallace House, as we're talking about our work as journalists, is sort of take a careful look at our responsibility as individual journalists and in our industry to think about the impact of the way we cover things on what shapes public narratives. And so I'd love to just turn to the audience for a second and think about the stories you've consumed about the movement of people here in the United States, in Europe, and other countries, and just throw out words or images that come to you. There's no right or wrong. I just want you to, just from the top of your head, throw out words that... Children in cages. Determination. What is it? Determination. Violence. Fear. Anguish. Desperation. So, cruelty. So this is an empathetic room, right? This is an empathetic room, and I think what I hear in the room is an indication that as you're consuming news, you're being a conscious consumer and critiquing some of the information that you see. One of the things that we see a lot as journalists is when a story pushes itself to the forefront, partly because of the desire for eyeballs or clicks, we center in on certain words that we know will drive attention, clicks, and sometimes controversy. And so Ish put together this kind of collection of headlines, and you see illegals have landed, right? Very, very alarmist language. Send an army to halt migrant invasion. Again, the term migrant and the term invasion. Migrants, how many more can we take? The swarm on our streets. And so
Islam rape on Europe, and refugees bring death-causing diseases. Fatal disease.
And so I think we just don't want to, because you're hearing people who cover this issue deeply, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that a lot of coverage of migration is actually covered from a very sensationalist lens, and that our profession also does harm to the people that we're talking about. And so, Jedrzej, I want to talk to you about the project that you started in Poland that is trying to turn some of this on its head.
Okay, so it was quite interesting to hear your responses, because I think that if you could ask this question in, let's say, in Poland, you would hear answer like, oh, black people black young people in boats that are gonna rape our women, things like that. So I'm also a sociologist by education and discourse analytic. So I was thinking for many years and months after the Belarusian crisis and the beginning of the full-scale invasion, how to change some narratives among refugee and migrants, and I came to the idea that the best idea is to let them talk to us, to let them understand, because if you give the voice to the real people, they're starting to be real people, not some images, and they're becoming fellow human beings. And So me and our team in our newspaper, we came up to I think to create the idea just to change whole issue of our newspaper on June 20th, which is International Refugee Day and World Refugee Day, and turn it into a newspaper, a refugee newspaper, and dedicate all issue to refugees and let them talk to us as authors or co-authors, or sometimes as main characters of the story protagonists.
And just why this is noteworthy is that there was a study that came out last year sort of looking at all of the ways in which people are talked about on the move. 60% of newspaper articles that talk about migrants cover it from a negative lens, and less than 6% of newspaper articles actually include the voices
so
of
it
people
was so
themselves.
I will just let you to take a look on that. You can also train your Polish. It's very easy language, as you can know, trying pronouncing my name. And thank you, Sarah, for reminding me. So our goal was to tell not only stories about death and sorry, I hate talk when I'm sitting.
It was only a matter of time.
Yeah. Let's do some TED Talk. And stop distracting me. What I was talking about? Okay. So not only to talk about deaths and other monstrosities, especially if you have war in Ukraine just next to you, and you hear all the stories and like the Poland welcome millions of Ukrainian refugees. So we know all these bad things, but we needed also other sides. So we published many success stories of people who running their businesses and find love. I remember great love story of Tajik people who found the love in this hopeless place like Poland, and
Brianna has a song about it.
Yeah, it was exactly. I asked him to write it.
So I want to. We had an event on Monday at UMA that Ish put together, a sort of one-man conversation about migration as imagination. And one of the beautiful things that you said in that event is that often, certainly we as journalists, but people in general, when they're focusing on, because the issue of people moving for safety also often includes tragedy and danger, that we focus on that. But that as reporters, often when we ask people to talk about a moment in their experience, what they focus on is resilience and how they've overcome and how they've managed to make something out of the worst circumstance a human can be forced into, the need, the necessity of movement away from everything that they have, and that they focus on resilience. And so I'm going to have each of you, as we close, talk about a moment of resilience that you saw. And Jedrzej, we're going to start in Poland, and we need to move quickly.
Okay. So in October 2000, can I stand up? Thank you. On October 2024, I went to Kyiv to see the first big concert after the full-scale invasion. There were concerts of the biggest Ukrainian band, Okean Elzy, and I don't know. There's a Joseph. Like, is there any comparison to the US band? Like, I don't know, U2 or something like this? Yeah, but Bono never be also like the political leader and things like that. So this is a huge band, When I'm showing a photo with Sława Wakarczuk, the leader of the band, like, people in Eastern Europe are going crazy, because this is the idol of millions. So there were 5 concerts in the arena of the size, like Little Caesars Arena in
Kyiv.
Detroit. Yeah, but it was, of course, not in Detroit, in Kyiv. And I wanted to write not as like about Ukrainians as like as a heroes of this resilience, because not write another story about war or you know, deaths and things like that, but about life, about normal life, like about attempt to have some glimpse of normality when you know, wake up in the middle of the night because of air alerts and you throw up because you're so stressed and drone can destroy your building.
But in fact, this
Yeah.
concert was interrupted.
No, this concert wasn't. It was the first of 5.
Yeah.
But the last one, the 5th one, was interrupted by missile and anti-missile alert. And what they did was they evacuated whole arena in a couple of minutes to shelters, to underground station, like the metro stations and some underground garages. And the band went also there, and they finished the concert in subway in like this. And this is the video, which is for me is a symbol of resilience of Ukrainian people.
So this is the people having moved into the underground subway and finishing the concert.
Це розумію, але ви коли штукаєтеся...
А давайте щось веселе разом. Зараз.
Ish, can you talk to us about this woman?
Yes, I'll be brief, but what I will say is, so this is Osas Egbon. She is a Nigerian woman, and this photograph was taken by Kate Stanworth in Palermo, Sicily. Osas founded Women of Benin City, which is a charity that helps women, specifically Nigerian women in Sicily, flee situations of forced sexual slavery. And when I went to her, many times do stories with her. The final time I went to her, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago now, and I was doing another sort of trafficking, kind of modern slavery, kind of gender lens as a story, and she said, I'm sick and tired of journalists coming here to talk about my like trauma and what happened to me. I actually want to talk about like something we're doing. And she founded a center, a home really, in the mountains of Sicily, where she was putting in girls and women who had fled situations of forced sexual slavery. So this image, to me, speaks to that idea, right, that you mentioned that I had this event on Monday, that migrants, refugees, people come for all kinds of reasons. They move for all sorts of reasons, whether it's violence, whether it's persecution, whether it's just, you know what, I want to go somewhere different because I want to have a different life. But moving, it's always framed through the lens of violence, and I think it's really important to remember the humanity and the kind of like hope that drives those journeys. So crossing a border, getting on a boat, you know, these are acts of survival for sure, but these are also acts of the imagination because it takes hope to go somewhere. It takes hope to survive a war. It takes hope to go through a situation. I spoke about this on Monday, my own family situation coming from Somalia, fleeing the war in Somalia. I arrived as a 10-year-old refugee in the UK. We lived in a camp in Ethiopia. Hope and imagination got us through. You know, the violence didn't define us.
That is beautiful. And Sarah, I want you to help us close with a bit of a challenge of imagination for the audience and the way we see this landscape that we've been talking about this afternoon.
I think so. We started the conversation talking about we want to reframe the narrative, and that often is an exercise of imagination. Sometimes it's also just as simple as turning your head to the side and looking at an image that you've seen over and over again in a different way. And this is a a very simple map of the Mediterranean that I'm sure you're all used to seeing north-south, that gives you a certain way of looking at people coming from Africa into Europe. And simply by turning it on its side, we see actually just how close we are, how artificial these borders are, and how unnecessary all of this violence is. So I hope that just by simply shifting your perspective a little bit, this has given you a new way to think about movement, a new way to think about migration, and hopefully a new way to think about the Mediterranean.
So with that, oftentimes, you know, we have time for questions, but we knew with three reporters with such deep reporting history, we were going to be running up against the clock today. And so we have a reception across the hall that we'd invite everyone to. And we hope that you will take time to talk with Ismail, with Sarah, and with Jedrzej, and to talk with one another. And, you know, we will continue our conversations to try to really push for responsibility in journalism and how we cover these complex issues of the movement of people. And I encourage you, as you're consuming news, you know, to call your station, write a letter to the editor, and sort of really think about and interrogate. You know, we know that most journalists are working to do the best job that they can do under atrocious circumstances, and that a lot of what pushes these lenses that we've talked about are things like algorithms and things that are pushing rash decisions. But I think we do all have agency in how we create narratives and what we can argue for. And I want to thank our partners at the Weiser Center and WCEE that we get to have these conversations every year, and to thank Charles Eisendrath again for inspiring the work that we do through Wallace House to work with journalists who are really committed to international coverage, which increasingly involves cross-border collaborative reporting. And I'm so thankful to you all in the work that you're doing and the work of all of our Knight-Wallace Fellows, and to those of you who come regularly to these conversations that we have.
And to students, they were taking notes.
About journalism, and to those of you who are students who are engaged in this work. So thank you all for coming. We will see you across the hall for food. What am I forgetting to do? Nothing? I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but we will talk about it across the hall. Thank you.